folks. Craig Lavati here with the Houston Museum of Natural Science. This is, of course, the Beyond Bones podcast. And, today, as you can see from the background, me and Johnny, we're at the beach because we are talking to our new friend, Bob Stokes, who is the president of the Galveston Bay Foundation. And it looks like, Bob, you're at the Bay as well. We're in Tulum. I have to go back to the kitchen.
Oh, man.
It's making me sad that I'm at home, that I'm not actually, at Galveston Bay.
Yeah, sadly, I'm not actually at the Bay either.
Yeah. Doesn't sound like it.
This is Zoom.
Yeah.
So, Bob, we were excited, obviously, to talk to you about the Galveston Bay and Galveston Bay Foundation, everything that you guys are a part of, and you have been holding this title as the president for 18 years. You said.
Yeah, just coming on 18 years. It seems like time has passed quickly, but it certainly has been a long time.
Galveston Bay, it's a beautiful part of our area here. I didn't realize either. We were doing a pre-interview and you were telling us that actually the watershed for Galveston Bay, as we know it, starts all the way up in Dallas-Fort Worth with the Trinity River. Yeah,
really, really north of Dallas-Fort Worth. So if you think about it, over half of the people in the state of Texas live in the Galveston Bay watershed. And for those folks who don't know what a watershed is, it's basically the area where when it rains, the water drains into that area. So, when it rains in Dallas-Fort Worth, the water comes into the Trinity River. When it rains in the Houston area, the water flows towards Galveston Bay, either through the Trinity River or the San Jacinto River or one of our many bayous. But that water from Dallas-Fort Worth comes all the way down the Trinity River and lands in Galveston Bay. So, they have a connection to the Bay, whether they know it or not.
It's so important too, because that brings us back to sort of the idea of keeping the Bay clean, and keeping the Bay clean is a job that starts way far up north from from Houston too. Absolutely.
I mean, really, right. So hopefully there's not a lot of trash flowing down the Trinity River, but there certainly are pieces of floatables and, the stuff you see, plastic bottles and styrofoam that comes down with any big rainstorm. But a lot of that stuff comes from the Houston area too, that floats from your yard or maybe your pickup truck or a trash can that's overflowing when it rains or when the wind blows. That stuff ultimately winds up in the bayou or the storm sewer and heads to Galveston Bay. It's a pretty depressing thing to go down to the top of the bay after a big rainstorm and see all the trash that runs down. So yes, we absolutely need to be aware of how our actions can impact the health of Galveston Bay.
It kind of boils my blood a little bit if I can be so pedantic about it. But when you see it sometimes in traffic, people reach out their window and just kind of drop their big gulp, out of their car or whatever. I always want to get out of the car and smash it on their antenna. It's there you go. you drop something, because it's exactly what you're saying. The watershed, I don't know what these people think happens to that styrofoam cup or plastic cup after they drop it out of the window, like a street sweeper is going to come get it, or it magically turns into stars or something like that. But it goes down to Galveston, and it's terrible. And it's not just that it's, bad for the environment. It's just really ugly to look at. Like you're saying, after a big rainstorm, you can see what's outflowing to the Gulf and everything. And it's kind of depressing. The other thing is, we're talking about the watershed. It's always fascinating to me how you'll see kind of high river warnings or not high tide warnings, but high river level warnings when it hasn't rained around here. But like you said, if Dallas and up north there, North Texas, north of Houston, we're in the sunshine and they're just getting pummeled by inches and inches and inches of rain, it all comes down here. And yes, the bayous can fill up and it can kind of overwhelm the water treatment centers and things like that. So it's a very interesting scientific and geographic point that the watershed is so big that even if you're north of Houston, what you do can directly affect the Galveston Bay area for sure.
And it's actually worked to our benefit recently. Our area is sort of headed towards a drought, and it's been raining a bunch up in Dallas-Fort Worth. They've been getting a lot of thunderstorms, and that water does make its way down to Galveston Bay, which is a good thing because Galveston Bay is really healthy because it mixes the fresh water from our rivers and streams and bayous with the salt water from the Gulf of Mexico. Galveston Bay is a brackish estuary is what it's known as. And it's really healthy because it has that fresh water coming down with the nutrients and all kinds of plants and animals and fish do well in this brackish environment. And so, obviously nature throws us a curveball every once in a while, and we have either drought or flooding, and we've had a lot of flooding really over the last 5 or 10 years. That's what we've seen, the Tax Day flood, the Memorial Day flood, Hurricane Harvey. Arguably, we've had too much fresh water in Galveston Bay over that time period. But it looks like we are sort of headed towards a drought. And each of those things can have, mixed results on the health of the bay, depending on how long they last. Particularly oysters are impacted by low salinity when it gets really fresh, like after Hurricane Harvey. Or when the salinity gets real high, the predators for oysters do well. So the oysters like the high salinity, but sadly their predators like the high salinity too. There are some things that proliferate when the salinity gets too high, and so oysters struggle. So it's a big mix. Sometimes it's Mother Nature. Sometimes we worry about the impacts of climate change and the extreme storms we've had recently, the extreme flooding we've had recently. So we just have to continue to work to do what we can to improve the health of Galveston Bay so it's resilient to these sort of long-term impacts that are happening.
People don't realize either that, the salinity you're talking about with the oysters too, there's a big economic impact that comes with Galveston Bay being healthy. It needs to be healthy, especially for our local economy.
Yeah. So, there's the direct economic impact, the commercial fisheries, and the recreational fisheries. So commercial fisheries in Galveston Bay revolve around basically oysters and shrimp, and to a lesser extent, blue crabs. The finfish that we have in Galveston Bay, there's not a commercial fishery around it, but there's a huge recreational fishery. Some folks who are out there wade fishing, or they hop in their boats and they're chasing, the speckled trout and the red drum. If those fish and shrimp and crabs and oysters are not doing well, people don't spend money out on the bay. The people who make their living on the bay, the oystermen, they've really actually struggled recently. There's been a lot of news about the scarcity of oysters in Galveston Bay and across the Texas coast. So absolutely, people depend on the health of Galveston Bay for lots of reasons. And we didn't even get into the recreational users. You just want a place you can go fish or swim or kayak, and make sure the water is clean and healthy. You don't have to worry about getting sick. So there's so many reasons to make sure that everybody in the Houston area cares about a healthy Galveston Bay.
So Bob, how big is Galveston Bay?
Yeah, so the bay is roughly 600 square miles of water. And so when we talk about Galveston Bay, there's a number of sub-bays that people talk about as being included within the Galveston Bay system. So when you hear about Trinity Bay, which is over near Anahuac, the sort of upper end of Galveston Bay where the Trinity River flows in, Trinity Bay is part of the Galveston Bay system. When you hear about East Bay, which is over near Bolivar Peninsula, that's part of the Galveston Bay system. West Bay is a place that a lot of people spend. A lot of Houstonians go down to Galveston Island. Galveston Island is on West Bay, also part of the Galveston Bay system. And then even further west of there, southwest of there, is Christmas Bay, which is sort of our most pristine part of Galveston Bay. It's in Brazoria County at the very southwest end of Galveston Bay, also part of Galveston Bay. So all these sub-bays, and there's even smaller sub-bays. There's Burnett Bay and Dickinson Bay, and you name it. There's all these little bays make up the entirety of the Galveston Bay system. And it comes all the way up to the upper Houston Ship Channel. So Buffalo Bayou drains as another main tributary into Galveston Bay, and it ultimately becomes the Houston Ship Channel at the very top of Galveston Bay. So it's big, and touches 4 counties: Harris County, Chambers County, Galveston County, and Brazoria County. And our region is just actually still very, very different, right? So everybody knows Houston, or most people know Houston. It's a big urban area with lots of people. Chambers County is on the east side of Galveston Bay. There was a time not too long ago where there were more alligators than people who lived in Chambers County.
How long ago was that?
Well, before it could be close now, but before Hurricane Ike happened in 2008, and a lot of pushed into Chambers County, and alligators don't do as well in salt water, and so a lot of alligator mortality. But the point being is there's a lot of wildlife still out in Chambers County on the east side of the bay, although it's growing pretty quickly. There's a lot of new subdivisions happening out that way these days too. So, but it's a really neat area. It extends a wide, a wide geographic area is the Galveston Bay system. Galveston Bay really comes up all the way to Houston. I live in Houston. I live inside the loop in Houston. And when I took this job 18 years ago, I can tell you almost every one of my friends said, "Oh, Galveston Bay Foundation, are you moving to Galveston?" And I said, Galveston Bay is different than Galveston. Galveston's like this super cool place, and the island, but the bay is much, much bigger than Galveston Island. It's a much bigger body of water. And yes, it comes all the way up to Houston. So it's interesting. And the other thing, just to think about Galveston Bay, we don't have a big downtown on our bay. If you go out to like San Francisco and you look out the window, you look at San Francisco Bay. If you go to Seattle, you look out the window, you see Puget Sound. If you go to Baltimore, you look out the window, you see Chesapeake Bay. Downtown Houston, if you're lucky, you can see Buffalo Bayou, but a lot of people don't understand that Buffalo Bayou then flows down to Galveston Bay. So we do have to sort of address that and sort of raise awareness about Galveston Bay. And hey, it's right down the street from downtown Houston, believe it or not.
So I've got kind of a two-part question. First of all, it is very interesting if people look at the map, and if you follow Buffalo Bayou from Galveston Bay and from the Gulf of Mexico, really, you see how it intertwines and basically it's nearby a lot of people in Houston, and how it's all connected, and the ship channel and everything. It's all one continuous thing. You'd be surprised how far that system goes and how far it expands. My two-part question, though, doesn't really have anything to do with Buffalo Bayou. I know it was almost exactly 12 years at this point. I'm looking up at my Google screen here. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill, did that affect the Galveston Bay system at all? And if it did, are we still feeling effects from that?
Yeah, so we didn't have any direct impact in Galveston Bay from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Texas really had limited impacts directly from the Deepwater Horizon spill. We had about 60 miles of lightly oiled beaches, towards Beaumont that had some oil from Deepwater Horizon. But what we talk about is that, a lot of our species in Galveston Bay, nearly all of our fish, crabs, and shrimp spend some portion of their life cycle in the bay, but also some portion out in the Gulf of Mexico. So we have a lot of shared resources with our other Gulf states in the Gulf of Mexico. And so when there's impact in Louisiana, when there's impact in Mississippi like that, it can definitely impact our population. So we didn't see oil in Galveston Bay, but certainly indirectly we had impacts. And I'll tell you another, I would argue this is a direct impact. When Louisiana had all that oil, a lot of their fisheries were closed, including their oyster fisheries. And so people wanted oysters. They wanted to eat oysters. All those oystermen from Louisiana came over to Texas to try to find oysters in Texas. And it put a lot of pressure and a lot of demand on our Texas oysters. So again, a direct impact from Deepwater Horizon. It wasn't oil, but it was people from Louisiana coming and grabbing oysters. And, there's nothing wrong with people from Louisiana coming and grabbing our oysters. They go to the same market for the most part. It's just there were a lot more people chasing, what was ultimately a scarce resource.
So you started 18 years ago, obviously, and the foundation's been around since '87. What are some of the big changes that have come over these decades with the foundation? Has the mission changed at all?
Well, no, actually, the mission's always been centered around the natural resources of Galveston Bay and trying to preserve those natural resources for future generations. So I like to talk about how we want to make sure our kids can enjoy the bay the same way we enjoy it today, and their kids can enjoy the bay, and so on. So the good news is, I think we can argue that the bay is healthier today than it was in 1987. Certainly back it's healthier today than it was in 1972 when the Clean Water Act was passed. So the Clean Water Act is so fundamental to essentially clean water across the nation, but particularly Galveston Bay. It regulated all the point source discharges. So what I mean by that is that we have all these chemical plants and refineries, and they all have discharges to Galveston Bay. Well, they're all permitted now. So there's an oversight authority that makes sure that whatever's coming off those plants and facilities is permitted and is not going to have an impact on the health of the bay. So the bay, our water is absolutely cleaner today than it was 30, 40 years ago. And, what we worry about now is, Texas is so successful. There's tons of people moving here. There's a lot more, housing developments. There's a lot more land being gobbled up, a lot more sort of sprawl that leads to, more runoff. And we call that non-point source runoff. It doesn't have like a particular place it comes from, like a permitted facility, but it comes from all of our houses, all of our yards, all of our driveways, and it runs down to Galveston Bay. And so that's kind of a harder pollution to really address, because it's so indirect and so, broad. But that's the issues that we really need to work on these days, is to make people across Galveston Bay area recognize that they can have either, a positive impact on the health of Galveston Bay or a negative impact, depending on what they do at their own home.
So it's almost like you can't really see that sort of, it's not pollution I guess it's more of a population impact on the bay.
Yeah. And, you can feel it when you lose open space. Like if you have, a nice coastal prairie or a nice forest next to Galveston Bay, it absorbs water, it slows down runoff into the bay, naturally cleans the water before it gets to the bay. But if you have a big subdivision with a lot of impervious surface, like driveways and roofs, that water just flows quickly off of that area, doesn't have a chance to naturally filter at all, and then flows into Galveston Bay. And that water is going to be dirtier, certainly, than it would be if it had a nice, cleansing sponge, so to speak, to absorb it before it goes down to the bay.
What are some of the common pollutants that you find along your travels along the bay?
Well, so when I talk about pollution of Galveston Bay these days, I really talk about it in two buckets. And one is historical pollution. And it's actually things that happened before the implementation of the Clean Water Act that still plague us today. And I'll give you an example. We've been working for over a decade now to get a Superfund site cleaned up. It's called the San Jacinto Waste Pit Superfund site. It's at the base of the San Jacinto River, where it also flows into Buffalo Bayou and the Ship Channel and into Galveston Bay. And in the late 60s, there was a paper company on the Houston Ship Channel that was making paper, and a byproduct of making paper is this liquid pulp waste. It has a lot of dioxin in it. And the paper company at that point in time, again, before the Clean Water Act, so this was how they did things back then. They took that waste and they put it into some barges, and they dug a pit next to the San Jacinto River and put that waste into the pit, covered it up, and left. Well, over time, the San Jacinto River, there was a lot of subsidence, which means our ground was sinking. And so the river sort of widened, and it started flowing into these pits, and it washed all that paper and pulp waste and dioxin-laden waste into the upper Ship Channel and ultimately into Galveston Bay. And we're still paying the price today because of something that happened basically in the 1960s. The good news is we're trying to get that cleaned up, and EPA is working on it. That cleanup is about to start. The rest of the waste that's still in those pits is capped, so there's no more waste flowing into the bay. But that's a great example of historical contamination that still has some impacts today. The other real pollution issue that we deal with, the modern day pollution, is really about bacteria and sewage. We have so many people who live around the bay system. Many of those people have septic systems that aren't maintained, and it causes sewage flow off, or just simply the city of Houston. The city of Houston has 4 million people, and some of the pipes that carry the sewer to the sewage treatment plants are 100 years old, and they're broken in places. And so there's a lot of, untreated sewage that seeps out. And particularly when it rains, there's sewage overflows. And so we can have high bacteria levels. The good news is bacteria naturally attenuates pretty quickly. So, after it stopped raining, within a couple of days, that bacteria levels go back down. But it can be a health hazard. And that's why you have down on the beach side, you have these beach watches, particularly after it rains. They'll close beaches in Galveston because of high bacteria levels that are directly due to sewage overflows. So, that really takes a lot of time and money to fix. The good news is the city of Houston's working hard to fix some of those old pipes. They're under a consent decree with the Environmental Protection Agency that really forces them to do some of that. But that's kind of our biggest modern day issue. Like if you're out in the bay after a big rainstorm, I would make sure that you double check the bacteria levels before you take a big swim.
I was going to ask on that note, because I've been reading and researching. I want to take my family on a little kind of Texas coast vacation. My wife is from Virginia, and I want to show her that Texas does have some legitimately beautiful beaches. Like there's great places to go along the Texas coast. It's not all just South Padre. There's way more around the coast here. So anyways, my question is, speaking of, being extra careful going to Galveston or wherever, Corpus Christi, anywhere, anything where has a big city that after it rains, it kind of brings all that to the bay. What do you think is the best kind of window, the cleanest window of opportunity to go visit a Texas beach?
Well, let me just say this. I don't want to oversell the worry here. I mean,
Right.
For the most part, Galveston Bay, I would go out and swim and fish any day of the year.
Me too.
So it's not like it's really polluted. Galveston Bay is actually really healthy compared to what you might think with all the people around it and all the industry around it. It's a pretty healthy bay that produces a ton of seafood. People swim and fish all the time in Galveston Bay. So it's really just, after a big rainstorm anywhere on any coast in the United States where there's a population. So the same thing happens in California. The same thing happens in New Jersey, where I'm originally from. It's just we have these old sewage systems that sometimes can't handle the really extra overflow that comes when it rains. So it's just, and that's why we have the beach watches. So the Texas General Land Office has these specific beach watches. And so, I wouldn't worry about this as an issue, but, just if you have a big rainstorm, check the Texas watch, which will tell you the bacteria levels. And so those are the really issues that I would worry about. So, but on a day, we haven't had a lot of rain recently in Houston or anywhere on the Texas coast. So go enjoy the coast and don't even think twice about it.
All right. Now, Bob, how can common people out there that are fans of the Bay, fans of nature, how can they help out the Galveston Bay Foundation?
Well, I think the simplest way is to come out and volunteer with us. We have volunteer opportunities really year round. We slow it down in the summertime because it's so hot, but certainly spring and fall are our high season for volunteers. We have all kinds of different volunteer opportunities. We have people who come out and help us pick up trash. We have people who come out and help us plant marsh grass. We do an event every spring and fall that we call Marsh Mania. We've been doing it 20 years. Yeah, you come out, you get a T-shirt that says you're a Marsh Maniac even. So, you learn about the value and function of wetlands. And I grew up in a place where I mowed my lawn. And so it's sort of the opposite of mowing your lawn. When you mow your lawn, you start and there's all this grass and you cut it and you look back and it looks super nice and clean and tight. In this case, it's the opposite. You come down to a shoreline and there's no marsh grass. And you and your fellow volunteers plant a whole bunch of stalks of marsh grass. And by the end of the morning, you look back and you've got like a quarter acre or a half acre of marsh, and it looks super cool. And you can then come back and watch that marsh grass grow, and because it continues to grow after people plant it. And so that's an easy volunteer opportunity.
Bob, why is that marsh grass so important?
Yeah, so marsh grass is our fundamental wetland plant in Galveston Bay. It grows in the intertidal areas around the bay system. We've lost acres and acres of it over the last 50 to 60 years. So we try to restore that marsh grass. There's a lot of reasons we lost that marsh grass, but we work with a lot of partners to restore it. And so, the grass provides habitat for birds and fish. It also is a buffer against storm surge. Slows down the waves basically before they hit the land. And then also wetlands like that will actually filter the water. So as water is flowing through the wetlands, a lot of times if there is pollution, it's contained in the mud and kind of in the sediment, and the wetlands will filter out that sediment, and the water that flows through a wetland is cleaner than when the water that entered the wetland. So there's all kinds of reasons to restore marsh and wetlands across Galveston Bay, and we spend a lot of time doing that. So we have another way for people to get involved. We have what we call citizen scientists. We have a group of about 50 people across Galveston Bay who have volunteered to take water quality samples at one specific location. They do it at least once a month to create sort of background data for that particular site. And people get involved, and it's really, relatively easy citizen science. They're taking a measurement. They do a pH measurement. They do a temperature measurement. They do a salinity measurement, and then we do have some volunteers who also take the bacteria measurements as well. So again, it's a great way to get involved, and people sort of have ownership of those particular sites and are really proud to be part of it.
So yeah, like the citizen science aspect is something that we love here at the museum as well. We encourage people to get out there using things like the iNaturalist app. And you're right. You do take ownership for that little area that you're, even if you're just taking measurements, you're taking samples, you would take ownership of that.
Yeah, and then you basically look out for the area as well, right? I mean, if there's really anything that we've had some situations where, someone was taking a water quality sample and they had a spike in the bacteria level, and it turns out there was a broken sewer pipe nearby, and that person really helped us pinpoint that and get it fixed as soon as possible. So these things do have some really good direct impacts as well.
You brought up oysters earlier. That made me very hungry because I'm an oyster guy. I understand the Galveston Bay Foundation is throwing Oyster Fest on June 4th at the Buffalo Bayou Park. Tell us about Oyster Fest. Should we bring our own hot sauce? How does that work?
You know what? We're going to have plenty of hot sauce. We're going to have plenty of oyster, plenty of seafood. This is actually an event we've been trying to put on since 2020. Our initial Oyster Fest was scheduled for April 2020. Well, you know what happened in the spring of 2020, COVID hit, we had to cancel, and we weren't able to do it in 21 either. We have now scheduled it for 2022. We've expanded it to Oyster and Sea Fest, in part because we're going to have, lots of things beyond oysters. But so it's going to be a big party, a lot of fun. If you're a seafood fan, come on out. And we'll have lots to eat and drink. There'll be a band or two, and it's just a nice little outdoor festival where people will hopefully have fun. And, we're not trying to teach people about the Bay, but if you're eating oysters, you're going to sort of learn about the Bay.
So if you want to get any information on how to volunteer, or if you just want to go chow down at Oyster Fest on June 4th, go to galvbay.org. We're going to have that direct website link here at the bottom of our screen, galvbay.org. Bob, thank you very much for joining us from the lovely locale over there, still behind you. What kind of bird is that? What kind of bird is that back there?
So that's roseate spoonbill.
Okay.
A lot of people confuse them with flamingos. We don't have flamingos that are local to Galveston Bay, but this is a super cool bird. It has some beautiful pink, and it's got a big bill to it, and loves to eat little critters across the bay. So there's a ton of birds in Galveston Bay. We have as many birds in the Galveston Bay system throughout the year as anywhere else in the country. So it's a great place to come on down and experience some nature as well.
And when you're keeping Galveston Bay clean, you're keeping those birds safe as well.
Come to the beach with me, Craig.
I gotta push the buttons and stuff. Okay, here we go. There, I'm back. Okay, all right. I didn't do you have any, Johnny, do you have any extra suntan lotion? Because our heads are gonna get burned.
Let's just squeeze whatever I have around me. I've got some fish food over here. Rub that on our feet.
Johnny.